Well, welcome and welcome to today's NEDAS webinar program. NEDAS, formerly the Northeast DAS and Small Cell Association, is an organization dedicated to educating the industry about the wireline and wireless convergence. We do host 4 events per year, as well as our webinar programs such as this. We do have our next webinar scheduled for Tuesday, April 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. That will feature Alex Besson of the Besson Group. The program is titled How to Develop a CBRS Case Study. It's going to be another very informative program that will offer you some usable tools and information about CBRS solutions. So back to today's program, 5G performance goals and potential applications. It is our honor to have Madan Jagannath with us today. We're expecting our program today to be no longer than 30 minutes. If you're logged in to the GoToWebinar application, your control window does have a question area. So as questions do come up, simply type them in there, and we will respond to all questions following the program. Throughout today's program, we do have a couple of polling questions along the way that will help to make the program today a little bit more interactive. So if you have any issues also during the program, please message me directly through the online dashboard. I don't expect any to occur, but you never know what will happen. So without further delay, I am pleased to welcome you to today's program featuring Madan Jagannath, the president of Future Mobile Services. Madan is a mobile broadband pioneer with more than 25 years of wireless experience. He has applied his broad experience and understanding of the evolving wireless industry to provide solutions for clients in the U.S. And his focus is on the application of technology to create end user value. He is also the president of Future Mobile Service, which he started in 2013. Madan founded FMS to provide advisory services for the mobile industry. And he currently is focused on the enabling technologies for 5G, in-building wireless, and IoT. Madan previously served in various leadership roles for internationally recognized companies, including Nortel Networks, Huawei Technologies, and Mavenir Systems. So without further ado, Madan, I hand this presentation over to you.
Thanks, Alyssa. 5G has been coming for a long time. When anyone will get consistent 5G service and what it will look like are still open questions. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madan Jagannath. Welcome to the webinar. Today, we'll take a look at the performance goals and applications for 5G and try to separate reality from puffery. So 5G is supposed to be the 5th generation of mobile services. But what have we got today? The first applications that we have seen, a nomadic service from AT&T with a hotspot device, fixed wireless service from Verizon, apparently using pre-standard equipment, or so it's reported in the trade press. These two things look very much like what Clearwire was offering a decade ago. This might be harsh commentary, but this is reality. The difference is that 10 years ago, Clearwire did not have a second act. All they had was one thing. For AT&T and Verizon, their first act looks more like prelude, something that they're doing to say they're first to 5G, not really an evolution of mobile services to the 5th generation. So there's a lot more to come on 5G. So to understand the context of all of this, I'll take a look at how we got here, what 5G really is, and realistic use cases. But first, can you take the survey, please? Do you think 5G is evolutionary or revolutionary? So I'll pause here for a moment while Alyssa puts that up, and then we'll get on with the webinar.
We'll give you about 15 more seconds, and then I'll close the poll. All right, I'll be closing that poll.
Okay, so as we look at the evolution from the first generation of wireless to where we are now, there are a few radio technology underpinnings that help to define each generation. We started with analog radios, FDMA, and fairly narrow channel bandwidths. Well, very narrow channel bandwidths. As we proceeded into the second generation in the 90s with GSM and CDMA, we got digital radios and much wider channels. Mobile broadband came in the third generation with CDMA 2000 and WCDMA, 1XR, TT, or EVDO, whichever came in with CDMA around that time. Now, UMTS, when it was initially introduced in around 2000, was just a new way of doing more expensive voice. It didn't add much to the capabilities from the 90s, which is why it took a long time for that technology to gain acceptance. And that's key here as we talk about 5G as well. You know, these networks up until then were voice-centric circuit switched networks. They were focused on voice data applications, including mobile broadband, first with UMTS and CDMA 2000. 1 megabit per second was broadband then. Though the broadband services were ancillary services, they're not the primary focus of what was happening. LTE and WiMAX changed all of that. LTE fundamentally is an IP network. It started out life as a data network, and it has continued life as a data network. Voice on LTE was introduced later on. VoLTE today is still just, or has become just 1% of the total traffic carried on 4G networks. Voice really is flat in the mobile network. The amount of voice is consumed as mobile voice. So as more data is added to the network, the amount of bandwidth needed for mobile voice decreases. So projections are that by the end of this decade, by 2020, at the end of 2020, VoLTE will be about half of 1% of all the traffic carried through the 4G network and potentially the 5G network. So that's where we are with 4G. So what do we have to look forward to with 5G? It's pretty much the same thing as 4G in terms of most of the stuff, except that we're getting new radio with wider channels starting in release 15 and 16 with a revised core network as well. All of this has been on a continuum from release 8 and release 9 when LTE was introduced to where we are today. The capabilities in the 4G network today are much better than the capabilities of the 4G network that was introduced with release 8. And as we go forward in time, starting with release 15 for 5G, we will see continuing incremental improvements in the 4G radios and the 4G network, as well as the introduction of 5G with new radio and the new core, the next-gen core that will come over time. So from this perspective, it's all part of long-term evolution, even though GSMA has stopped using LTE to describe what's happening starting in release 15. It's now all discussed as 5G. So if you want to know if you're getting 5G service, ask your product provider or service provider, are they supporting release 15? If it's not release 15 or higher, it's not 5G. And even if it's release 15 or higher and it's not the new radio, it's not 5G. So that's where we are with the realities. Some projections on 5G, numbers published by 5G Americas. The projection is that this year there will be less than 1 million subscribers of the 7 billion in the world that will actually be on 5G. By 2022, the projection is that there will still be globally more 2G subscriptions than 5G subscriptions. And 5G subscriptions will reach 1 billion users by 2023. That's 4 years from now. Right? 4 years from now. So this is more of a long-term growth of how services will be provided over time, and it's no different from any other generation that we have seen. As we look at performance targets, there are only 3 things to consider in 5G: latency, speed, and cost per bit. In terms of latency, the new radio is targeted to provide sub-millisecond latency inside the radio equipment. In the network, round-trip delay of less than 10 milliseconds, so a latency of about 4 to 5 millisecond improvement is what we'd expect to see based on the radio. The remainder of latency improvements will come from the core network architecture, the internet, what users actually experience for latency, and how that entire core network is architected and deployed is more important to latency than the radio itself. In terms of speed, the target is for an order of magnitude improvement in speed, with peaks up to 20 gigabits per second. Now, when we consider real-world applications, for LTE, when we started, the peak rates for LTE in 20 megahertz channel were over 100 megabits per second, but what users actually saw was much less than that. And the reason for that is when the industry quotes these peak rates, they're quoting it for ideal conditions in lab conditions with 1 user per cell to get the biggest number out there. Real world conditions will give much lower throughput per user, because when there's a full queue, the maximum number of subscribers in a cell, the scheduler will allocate resources to all of the users so that there's a fair usage of resources. So we can expect that when folks start quoting numbers about 5G, that the real world will be somewhere between 20 and 25% of the peak is what you may get in the real world as a realistic number. 5G will be applied both to the cellular spectrum and to the new spectrum allocated by the FCC. Gigabit speeds will be achievable in the millimeter wave spectrum, I expect, with wider channels possible, with massive MIMO possible, and those speeds will be achievable, but mobility may be a real challenge in the millimeter wave spectrum. And I'll get to the millimeter wave spectrum in a little bit as we get through the presentation a bit here. Cost. What's driving 5G and capacity increases is really the data demand in the network. Subscription rates have stayed relatively flat while data demand has increased exponentially. So operators have to find a way to reduce their cost per bit, not by 1 order of magnitude, but by 2 orders of magnitude to really deploy a service that they can meet the needs of the end users while still making money with relatively flat subscription rates. So a lot of what we see operators doing for several years now with 4G networks and being fundamental to 5G, with small cells, with NFV and SDN, and with edge computing, what was first called mobile edge computing is now being called multiple access edge computing. Those are all initiatives to drive cost out of the network so that operators can try to stay ahead of the data demand in the network with more users and hungrier applications or whatever else is driving demand. So the changes from 4G to 5G, as I'm showing on this chart, we're really looking at getting to wider channels. In cellular spectrum, up to 100 megahertz channel bandwidth will be supported. But not in every instance can someone deploy a 100 megahertz channel in cellular spectrum. For example, the recently auctioned 600 megahertz spectrum, in which T-Mobile will be deploying 5G, the entire spectrum band is less than 100 megahertz wide. So they will get to 5G in there, but the speeds will be limited by the available spectrum in that band. They may be able to do carrier aggregation across different spectrum, but that's a different story. Sprint is probably best positioned in cellular spectrum for 5G with their BRS EBS spectrum at 2.5 gigahertz, and they may be able to get a clear 100 megahertz channel for 5G, but they will have the usual challenges that they have had with covering inside from outside. So propagation becomes a big challenge for them. And as we look at this, the operators will have the same challenges of coverage versus capacity and the same trade-offs as we go forward into release 15 and beyond, as we have seen in the past. Power amplifier limits at the base station, antenna size limits on the towers. Trying to do massive MIMO in 600 megahertz is going to result in very large antennas, so that may not be possible at a cost-effective level. From the size of the antennas, the weight of the antennas, the lease costs, and those kinds of things. How much spectrum is available, the characteristics of propagation of the spectrum, and the device limitations. How many antennas can you put into the device? How much power will it take? Those kinds of things. And we're seeing some of those issues being addressed as the chipset manufacturers and the operators look carefully at how to optimize networks. But the reality of all of this is that as we look at release 15 as an introduction, 5G and cellular bands will be fractionally better than 4G in cellular bands from release 14 to release 15. So in the cellular bands, this is evolutionary from my perspective. Progress is likely to be quite similar to what we have seen in LTE from release 8 and release 9 to where we are with release 13 and 14 now. So over the period of 8 to 10 years, there's been lots of improvement in LTE, and this is just on the continuum as we go forward. So as we look at it, what about the high spectrum? This diagram shows the spectrum map that the FCC allocated for 5G, the so-called 5G spectrum. It's all TDD, there's no paired spectrum. There are two 425 megahertz bands in the 28 gigahertz range, and there are 12 200 megahertz bands in the 38 gigahertz range. It's possible to run wide channels in this spectrum band. Coupled with massive MIMO, we can expect very high throughput to end users, gigabit per second and better speeds. But delivering capacity consistently will depend on environmental factors as well. The primary issues will be about attenuation. In this spectrum, you really require line of sight or a strong reflected path to get any real throughput. Large antenna arrays will enable beamforming, so you'll be able to get extended range and improve throughput, and the antennas will not be very large. We've seen antennas that are quite small in the spectrum range. What will be a continuing issue is rain fade, just like it is with satellite broadcasts. Today in Florida, as I'm looking out my window, it's raining and visibility is about half a mile. In conditions like this spectrum will suffer from a lot of rain fade. Typically, when there's a torrential downpour, satellite service goes away. It's the same spectrum. I expect that when there are torrential downpours that obliterate visibility, such downpours will also obliterate 5G performance in these bands. It's not going to be any different. Physics hasn't changed. So from that perspective, it's not at all clear that 5G can be delivered to mobile devices with any degree of reliability in this band. But we have to see what folks come up with. Maybe they will prove me wrong. Let's look at this for a bit. Can this spectrum be used for mobile applications? If you get a lot of rain fade, and one of the key applications that's been touted for 5G is autonomous vehicles, it may be possible under good conditions to say, with a dense array of small cells, with beamforming, and with features like cooperative multipoint, where the end device is getting served by multiple cells simultaneously. Vehicles with roof-mounted antennas can get high speeds, high throughput to them and communicate effectively. But if you're depending on a link like that for the autonomous vehicle to operate correctly, do you really want to be in that vehicle during a torrential downpour? And something to think about as we talk about this. It might be possible to do, it might be possible to demonstrate, but is it something that is wise to do? Okay, so taking a closer look at latency and throughput. The new radio, as I said, will contribute about 5 milliseconds of improvement in round-trip delay, in the round-trip delay budget. Most of the improvement in latency and round-trip delay will come from techniques that have been around for a few years now with 4G. NFV, network functions virtualization, where functions are pushed to the edge, are a key part of this. Distributed computing, distributed network is a key part of this. Content at the edge, so that instead of delivering all content from centralized servers, the content is as close to the end user as possible. And highly distributed computing. All of this comes back to cloud computing with intelligence at the edge. And this is fundamental to data communications. The rules are when computing is cheap relative to transmission, computing is distributed. And the biggest challenge that operators have with 4G and 5G is backhaul. How do you get the fiber to the endpoint, or how do you get a highly reliable wireless link to the endpoint, so that your backhaul is very reliable? That's an expensive proposition, so edge computing becomes a fundamental part of all of this. For throughput, with the wide channels, 20 gigabits per second seems to be achievable, but not initially, and reliability in the high spectrum bands still remains a problem. So we will see how throughput improves, but as I said before, I expect it to be incremental from 4G speeds that we're experiencing today. Before I go on to the next subject, let's take another minute or so and do another quick survey. Do you expect to be able to receive 5G services this year?
So before I jump into this, Madden, I just want to share the results from our last survey, if that's okay. We did ask if you thought that 5G is revolutionary or evolutionary, and 55% said it was revolutionary versus 36% who said it was not. And 9% said they didn't know. So thank you for your participation. Now we're going to go on to our next poll. As Madden mentioned, do you expect to be able to receive 5G services in 2019? Would love for everyone's input here. And as soon as I close the poll, I'll do the recap and share the results. I'll give you another 8 seconds. All righty, we're going to close that poll right now and we'll share those results. So yeah, so 28% of you think that you will be able to receive 5G services in 2019. 69% of you, the majority, no, and 3% no clue. Love the honesty. Thank you. Back to you, Madden.
Oh, thanks, Alyssa. Okay, so what are the application targets for 5G? This gray area in this chart, this is a GSMA diagram, shows the 5G performance area. The applications enclosed in the rounded dashed red line are the targeted applications for 5G. Things like real-time gaming, and I see virtual reality, augmented reality, and tactile internet in there, and autonomous driving. Okay, so we talked about autonomous vehicles before. Where's 4G? This light blue area and this area is where 4G has been performing. Right, most of what we do today with smartphones is 4G. So there are very few new applications being considered here. And when we talk about applications, it's not just about 4G and 5G. There is Wi-Fi. And in the context of all of this, we need to understand whether users will use Wi-Fi, 4G, or 5G, depending on whether the application is nomadic or mobile. And as you look at it, these four, and whether the user is indoors or outdoors, these four applications can all be run today on Wi-Fi. And if you're indoor, the preference is to run it on Wi-Fi or a wired connection like Ethernet. Today, for this broadcast, I'm actually connected on Ethernet directly. If you're outdoors, in most cases, it's 4G, but that's a secondary thing. I mean, how many people are doing real-time gaming that requires high bandwidth and low latency out and about in the wild, or augmented reality or virtual reality, unless they're standing still? Certainly, I hope they're not driving and trying to do those things. As you get into the new applications that are targeted, tactile internet and autonomous vehicles, certainly these will be the focus of 5G as we go forward, and 4G will be the fallback position where you don't have 5G. But the network itself has to be able to support these things in the interim. So as we look at all of this, 5G is going to do some things, but in an evolutionary way for most of it. Wi-Fi is still a fundamental part of this. And if you consider some of the applications for 5G that are fixed or nomadic, they really look like backhaul for Wi-Fi rather than some new application itself. I would expect that the focus of 5G deployments in the short term will be general updates to Release 15, targeted small cell deployments in high traffic areas, and upgrades to stadiums and other high traffic venues. You can envision in cases where during sporting events that augmented reality would be a key applications that folks will want to push. It says you're watching an event, you're in the moment for the Super Bowl or the NBA Finals or whatever, and you get some augmentation of that experience because you're there and it's being delivered to you through a high bandwidth link. So there are some targeted applications that will benefit from this brand new network that is being deployed, but there are a small set of those to begin with. What is more likely is that we will see a long tail of applications that utilize improved network capabilities over time. Now, over the last year or so, I've been looking at how to get mobile services into the middle price. And as I look at that, entry of 5G into the middle price will largely be dependent on the availability of 5G capable small cells at reasonable costs. So that's my one plug for the stuff I've been doing for a while. So in summary, 5G really begins with release 15 using OFDMA as the ongoing modulation scheme, but with shorter time slots. The new millimeter wave spectrum will primarily be for fixed and nomadic access, I believe. Channel bandwidths will increase, so beyond carrier aggregation in 4G, where there have been up to 3 or 4 channels aggregated. We'll see wider channels with 5G up to 400 megahertz in the millimeter wave spectrum. And just incremental improvement, continuous improvement really as we go through from release 15 and beyond. So with that, thank you for attending the webinar today. I'll take questions. Alyssa has those and she will load them up. If any questions I don't get to today on the webinar, you can email me at info@futuremobileservices.com. And as we go through questions, Alyssa, do you want to do the feedback questions now, or?
Well, yeah, so we will be giving you some feedback questions after this program. So when you log out and when we send you our thank you for participating, we just ask that you kindly answer a couple of questions for us, and we appreciate that.
Okay, so I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, so before I open up for questions, I'm just going to give my little plug for NEDAS events. We do have an event coming up in Boston on July 17th. That registration and sponsorship opportunities are now open. We are also accepting speaker submissions for all of our events this year, including webinar programs. So if you have anything to submit for speaking, please go to our website and submit a speaking submission. Following our Boston event in July, we'll be in New York for our summit on September 5th. And then we'll be heading down to Washington, D.C. for another symposium on November 21st. As I mentioned at the beginning of our program, we have a webinar on April 30th, how to develop a CBRS business case. We do have a few other programs scheduled for the rest of this year. And we do have 2 that are available if you're interested and have something to say. We do have one question. And the question is, who's going to be paying for this? Who's going to be paying for this? Is the payment going to be upstream or downstream on 5G services? Do we have any idea how that's going to be priced out, Madden?
So the first indication we have for pricing is that Verizon says they'll charge an incremental $10 for 5G services when they launch 5G services. So if you just want 4G service, you pay whatever you're paying, and for 5G service, plus $10. However they do this, it's going to come out of the consumer at the end of the day, right? So whether it's explicitly in a service like 5G, like how Verizon is doing, or it's implicit in some other way, we still have to see, right? I mean, that's going to be the push and pull between the network operators and the internet service providers who are providing the services, the so-called over-the-top services that have actually been fundamental to the success of LTE. Day one, we see a model from Verizon.
All right. Well, very, very interesting, helpful. One more question just came in. It looks like it's about rain fade. Is there anything that can be done to reduce rain fade?
Oh boy. I don't know. I mean, this is fundamental physics here. The satellite folks have not been very successful. I think you could try to add power, but there are limits to how much power the FCC will let you blast out of the base station and the end device. And if you're trying to manage power in the end device, if it's a mobile device especially, where it's battery operated, then there's a limit to how much you can actually push through that device and how much you can put into that device from a power amplifier standpoint. So Making the link, even in broadcast like digital, like satellite, there are severe degradations in performance when you get thunderstorms and heavy clouds and things like that. When you're talking about two-way communications, you have to balance the link budget so that the uplink actually works as well. You have 2 points of failure, from the base station to the end user and from end user to the base station. So can something be done about it? I don't know that there are any easy answers to that.
Mhm. Well, good. It's an honest response. Um, I don't believe that we have any other questions at this time, so that brings us to the end of our program. Madden, thank you so much. Very informative, lots of great information in there, a lot of things to consider. And thank you all for our participants today for joining us. We appreciate your time and your interest. Hope to see you at one of our events in the near future.